Okay, thank you very much. We have a distinguished panel here, and I'm not going to take up time on things. I will start asking Craig Lowe to, I will mispronounce names brutally, so excuse me, to give a brief overview of the subject area, and then I will ask each of the panelists to answer a particular question, which I'll state after Greg's. Greg, you want to?
Yeah, so Dave, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Greg Rattray, I'm a senior research professor at Columbia University. And this panel is in part sponsored by Keio Cyber Civilization Research Center and Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, where we've established a US-Japan cyber and digital dialogue. Interestingly, we initiated it earlier this year in 2020, and the activities went on even despite the emergence of the pandemic. And we've had a couple of meetings and a big session back in June. So I thank Keio for the continued opportunity to foster that dialogue. And we plan to continue going forward in a series of activities. So hopefully you'll see evidence of that as we move forward. In terms of today's panel, one of the areas that we focused on, I know was a focus yesterday of the initial set of activities in this conference, or the themes of the conference, is the notion of collaboration in the formation of norms in cyberspace. So we have an excellent panel today to talk about that subject further. I think we'll stress that this is not just a governmental activity, it's a private sector activity as well. So looking forward to everyone's comments, Dave.
Okay, let me ask the same question of everybody, and we'll go around in order, at least the order that I have on my paper. The question is, as governmental and private sector actors across the globe weigh the value of cyber norms and collaboration, how do you see the opportunities for the US and Japan to collaborate and cooperate in sharing the agenda in this area? I'll start with Greg.
Right.
Try to do 3 to 4 minutes.
All right, thanks, Dave. And as we get into this, my background, and I think Dave, you wanted us, I'm going to give a quick little bit, because I think my perspective is informed by both government service. I was an Air Force officer for a long time, including service on the National Security Council staff. So I came to this issue as a governmental policymaker, and then transitioned to the private sector, and have spent time working with some on the panel, and as JP Morgan Chase's Chief Information Security Officer. So increasingly, I see this as a shared responsibility between governments and the private sector. And for the US and Japan, given the nature of our economies and our global engagement, then the idea that this has to be an activity that involves both the public and private sector is I think essential. And I think the private sector, and Ken's going to talk to it more, led often by the team at Microsoft and some of the activities that they've helped engender, which we supported when I was at JP Morgan very vigorously, are the types of things that are necessary. These norms in cyberspace are crucial, given, I think, the sort of this fundamental structural condition that good defense is very hard, not impossible, but very hard, and setting rules where attacks by a wide range of actors, both state and non-state actors, is essential. I wanted to focus a bit on, I think the normative development in terms of rules has been pretty good related to disruptive cyber attacks. And I think the key here, which has been stressed by some, and probably some others will talk about it, is accountability and making sure that people that are misbehaving, creating transgressions in cyberspace, are held accountable. And again, having served both in governmental and private sector roles in this regard, I think the private sector increasingly has insights and needs to help with the accountability of the acts that occur in cyberspace and create transparency. Dave, the other thing I wanted to mention in my opening remarks is this normative push, this rule setting to make cyberspace safe for economic activity, for social dialogue, does need to move into the broader digital, dialogues that occur on things like digital free flows with trust. The US and Japan have similar concepts of what is envisioned in terms of moving information around the globe and setting rules, making sure that privacy is protected as part of a trust construct. And I think we'll see cyber norms evolve into digital norms in that area. And the final area I'd point us to in sort of the future, and I think, as we move through the pandemic and we have an acceleration into the reliance on the digital world, is the evolution of artificial intelligence. Again, a crucial area of global competition, but also hopefully collaboration. And, I am increasingly concerned, having watched for 20 years or so, the evolution of cyber attacks, that the technology sort of outpaces our ability to defend them, into the use of artificial intelligence, the ability to attack the learning algorithms and other features of that technology needs to be a place where we develop norms and structures to make, misbehavior identified and not permissible and responded to. So I might have violated the 3-minute rule.
That's
Dave.
likely, but that's okay.
Hopefully that's a good start for everybody to segue from.
Ken, can I ask you to go
Sure.
next?
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to participate, and thank you all for tuning in today. So I'm Ken Katayama, Director for Digital Policy at Microsoft Japan. I work on digital policy issues, including cybersecurity. To Greg's point, so the answer, David, to your question is, really, and it sort of follows what Greg said, increased collaboration and multi-stakeholder involvement, both by the government and the private sector. In the case of U.S. Japan, in the government sector, we recently just did a U.S. Japan Internet Economy Dialogue, and then on the private sector, as Greg kindly pointed to, Microsoft is involved in various initiatives like the Cybersecurity Tech Accord and the Paris Call, which we'll probably talk about a bit later. Let me expand a little bit on just what I said. Just so once again, responding to David's question. Multi-stakeholder government work both in the private sector as well too. I'm based in Japan, and I work very closely with the Japanese industry here in Japan, and of course the Japanese government as well too. The Japanese government, led by NISC, which is our cybersecurity agency, is driving for a safe and secure cyberspace. It will probably come when we talk about norms. We obviously talk about the GG. And the norms that were decided back in 2015. The application of law to the cyberspace, in 2017, we think about WannaCry, and increasingly nation-state actors, have the capability to initiate cyber attacks. Microsoft, in 2018, we talked about a Digital Geneva Convention. And in 2018, we talked about a Cybersecurity Tech Accord. Fast forward to 2020, I'm happy to say that in Japan, and we'll talk about the Paris Call a little bit later, but Japanese companies are also involved. Not only the United States, but Japanese companies are also involved in this initiative called the Paris Call to build a safe and secure cyberspace. So I think that was my 3 minutes, David. I'll hand the floor back to you. Thank you.
Hey, you actually cut it short.
Oh, really? Okay.
So I'll give you some time later on. Josh Walker, you want to?
Absolutely. Well, it's great to be with everyone. Konbanwa to everyone in Japan. Joshua Walker here in New York at the Japan Society. I'm the new president and CEO, and I'm really excited to be talking about this topic because if you had told me that when these conversations were beginning over 10 years ago or even a year ago with Greg's and Columbia and Keio's great initiative, that there would be this much interest, that we would have the level of connectivity, I would have thought, well, yes, it's important, but there's some other key areas. I think the pandemic has made it abundantly clear that kind of cybersecurity is not a subset. It's not separate from national security. They're one and the same. And I think in some ways, there needs to be a mindset shift. And I agree with what the panelists have already said, which is there's a lot of area for cooperation between the US and Japan. I think in a world of uncertainty, where the president of the United States has come down with COVID, we have an election a month from now. The term October surprise has a whole new meaning now in terms of what could happen. Things that we just talked about, cyber attacks, the leaks of the emails from 2016, all these things are now part of our parlance. That's what we're used to dealing with. And social media is so ubiquitous that political campaigns can't go ahead without them. And I think when it comes to the role of the public and private sector, they're merging, because clearly governments have a responsibility, particularly in democracies, to protect the way in our way of life. And part of that is becoming increasingly our cybersecurity. And so simply saying, well, those that have the money and the corporations that can protect it are kind of on their own, and the rest of us are on our own, is increasingly untenable. And I actually think in this sense, Japan has a larger role than ever, because when you think about traditional military security, there's a real hesitation, obviously, in Japan because of the history there, as we think about the 75 years since the end of World War II. But I think increasingly in cyber domain, Japan has a larger role to play. It's not just because it's the third largest economy, it's one of the most stable democracies in the world, but increasingly the capabilities need to catch up. And I think what we've already heard about the rule norms and the shaping need to go into this. I think about Japan as being a critical country that can help transform whatever period we're in, going from a G2 to a G1 to a G0, or whatever terminology you want to use, about thinking about becoming a rule kind of shaper. It may not be a maker. It can't set the rules by itself. It needs to have consensus. But I think, like all things in cybersecurity, no one country, no one entity can dominate. It needs to be a consensus that all of the free countries and kind of actors and stakeholders come together. So I think here, whether it's US and Japan business cooperation, whether it's on the government side and deep security and intelligence sharing, all of us need to be working more closely together. And the first step to that is an awareness among our publics. As democratic societies, we have to convince the public of the need. And increasingly in the United States, as we see in the political section, there's a larger understanding of the damage that countries like China or in North Korea or Iranian actors can use. And cyber attacks is a very useful tool in kind of the gray zone. Is that really a military strike, or is it a preemptive? Is it offensive? Is it defensive? So there's a lot of areas that we need to expand upon. And simply the fact that we need to explain the language we're using is one of the most useful things that I think these forums and US and Japan can be together. Because if the US and Japan can agree to a certain set of norms and rules that will shape the international cyber domain that we play in, that increasingly will help other places around the world. And I just think, finally, it's not just on the US-Japan. For so long, the US-Japan alliance has looked in terms of our own domain, in terms of our security. But here, we almost have to bring in our European allies. We have to bring in our New Zealand, Australia, Canadian allies to think about this holistically, because the more that we can get people to adopt our rules and norms and not create these two internets that might be beginning to be created in the geotechnology, whatever term you want to use, Cold War tensions, problems between US and China. I think Japan increasingly will play a bigger role. So I think I've eaten up my 3 minutes. Let me stop there and turn it back for further questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Barbara, can we ask you to go next?
Thank you, David. So my name is Farber Grewe. I'm with the MITRE Corporation, and I'm focused now on international strategy and policy, particularly cyber capacity building in the ASEAN arena, and have spent the past 3.5 years working with NISC in Japan on cyber preparations for the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. I think an important thing about the perspective I bring to this comes from my work in the traditional security realm, having come from the 9/11 Commission, where focused on the failures of information sharing and the outcomes of that, including 3,000 people dying. And so learning those lessons in traditional security and now bringing them to the cybersecurity realm. I think the important thing with the US-Japan relationship is that the US started a series of cyber dialogues, bilateral dialogues on cyber issues. And the very first country it started these dialogues with was Japan, recognizing the importance of Japan to these issues and that relationship to building a stronger cyber ecosystem globally. And when we talk about norms, I think importantly for the US and Japan, we do have those shared values, shared approaches that are important of why we have global norms in the first place. You know, we want the mutual signaling, we want predictability, we want stability, and the US and Japan are able to do that because of our shared values and our shared approaches to these things. But I think one of the things I'd like this panel to really focus on is creating norms is one thing, but enforcing norms is a very difficult challenge, because if you don't have everybody in the globe signing on to particular norms, what impact will these norms have? And how can you make sure that these norms are in fact a basis for behavior across the world? And I think the other problem is with norms, these norms are often signed on to by nation states, but when we look at the cyber realm, all of the issues in cybersecurity are not nation states. And if you have the nation state saying, okay, we agree to this, but you've got individual actors, the criminals, the hacktivists, all of these other kinds of actors who are not signing on to it, what difference can having these norms be? So I think those are the kinds of topics that I hope that we will explore further in this panel. Back to you, David.
Okay, thank you very much. Kazuo, you're next.
Yes, thank you, Farber Sensei. This is a very important topic, the norm. My name is Kazuo Noguchi, Executive Director of the Inc. COE, and also Senior Researcher of Keio University. And also I'm part of the Hitachi Group in New York City. Last December 2019, I had kind of honored and fortunate to participate at the UN Open-Ended Working Group as a part of the private sector speaker scene setting representing Hitachi. So here's my personal view. Confidence and capacity buildings together in the US, Japan, in government, industry, and academia are critical aspect going forward. And the trust aspect is in particular in the digital world. Towards deterrence is also important. Yesterday, actually, there is a very interesting discussions from the trust to deterrence. It's very different aspect. But as a civilian corporate person, I like to address a couple of challenges, which is particularly the asymmetric nature of the corporations by the cyber actors. The first thing is that the asymmetric disadvantage against nation-state sponsored attacks, it's very difficult to prevent sometimes. No active defense to find or getting the law and so on, creating the norms. It's a very important one to agree upon and build on it from the corporate perspective. Actually, the last year, the Japanese cyber ambassador Otaka, we had this interesting conversation that norm is very, very soft, but after getting involved for this UN open-ended, as well as knowing the US, the Solarium report and so on, more and more the term of norms are important. So the second thing that I like to mention is that working together, US-Japan confidence building, capacity building is quite important in government, not only government, but industry and academia, particularly the critical infrastructure, such as electric power grid and the transportation and the water. Those are critical for the human life. So building a trust services among alliances to secure the global supply chain with digital, it's a very important one. Now, finally, I'd like to mention also the defense forward concept. The US Solarium report actually described very well. Is really good to have the reference with the US, Japan. Norms defined no attacks for critical infrastructure, for instance, as defined the UN 11 norms. That's very referenceable for the corporations, how to not to escalate. Sharing the vision between US and Japan, information sharing, as Barbara also mentioned, and confidence and unclassified information, how to define that in the digital world or information world for the human life. Finally, building norms between US and Japan in government and private and academia towards a trusted global supply chain with a digital trust. Those are the things that we would like to think going forward. Back to you.
Okay, before I start on that, I will take the privilege of the moderator to insert a couple of comments of my own. One of the activities we've been looking at seriously at Keio was something we call Cyber Silent Spring. For those of you who are old enough, you know the Silent Spring on the environmental. The problem we're addressing is that, in fact, attacks on critical infrastructure and attacks on critical things in nation states may cause a response that will escalate to more attacks, cyber attacks, and potentially escalate uncontrollably to more destructive attacks like weapons. And we've seen scenarios like that, and we're trying to understand, in fact, just how likely that's to be and how you defuse it. The other observation I'll make is that security also is difficult in a world where our hardware and our software and our protocols were never designed to be secure. And so it's, that turns out to be a major problem. So part of building security has to be understanding that the technology has to be improved. End of lecture. I'm going to ask actually Greg to, what did the recent Congressional CELA report actually say about this subject?
Thanks, Dave. And Kazuo had, when we were putting this panel together, called it out and mentioned it a bit as well as something that I think this audience would really be well served to understand. For those who don't know, the U.S. Congress sponsored a major commission, that made its findings last spring. The commission actually continues its work at a sort of smaller scale in terms of whether its recommendations are being adopted. So I would say, as an observer of U.S. cyber policy making, this was the sort of singular, most focused major review, if we call it that, that has landed in the last couple of years. So its findings in general are a good illustration of how U.S. cyber thinking is going. I think it's relatively mainstream, but there's a good, strong aspects to it. On this topic, it demonstrates the continued, at least U.S. cyber community policy thinking that norms are crucial, right? That one of the major pillars of the report is strengthening norms and international engagement. Again, I think, and Kazuo mentioned forward defense as well. I think the report has a strong theme that defense in cyberspace is hard. It makes suggestions for improving critical infrastructure protection and public-private collaboration. But in addition to that, you need a multi-layer strategy, which includes norms to help deter, to make negative consequences for those that attack, as well as using forward defense. I'm going to link this. The other thing that is interesting in the report in this subject area, there's this notion of confidence building, right? And I'm going to, for the people in the audience, sort of distinguish that. If capacity building is helping other parties, whether they be corporations or nations, do better in defending themselves in cyberspace. Confidence building is this notion that Barbara mentioned of stability, that in a area where you do have cyber attacks, the Solarium Commission report calls out the need to return to more confidence building measures. And it gets to something that was mentioned, which is our international community writ large, with the major states being increasingly competitive, have real dangers that cyberspace becomes an environment where attacks and escalatory activities take place. Also, having been at this a while before cyberspace emerged as a security issue, and having served at Strategic Air Command with nuclear weapons, we learned how to talk with our adversaries with hotlines and understand where we didn't want to go in this area. And we called those things confidence building measures. So one of the interesting things, if you get the chance to look at the report, is it calls for norms, do not commit bad acts in cyberspace, but it also calls on nations to be able to talk to each other and reduce escalation and the probability of a strategic problem in cyberspace through confidence building measures. So again, the report is a real source of thinking around these issues. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Ken, you can do two things with my next question. Question is, how did Microsoft and the private sector play a role in the Paris call, and how are those activities viewed in Japan? So there are three things that are like what the Paris call is, right? And then the private sector and the Japanese view.
Thank you, David, for the question. Let's see, so the Paris call for the audience itself, and it builds on what Greg and others have mentioned. So the Paris call is something that President Macron back in 2018 on the 100th anniversary of World War I called for trust and security in the cyberspace, which had 9 global principles, meaning promotion of norms and confidence building measures, but also more importantly, prevention of attacking, preventing interference in elections, protecting the public core of the internet, preventing harm to people and critical infrastructure itself. At Microsoft, our mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. So you all use technology, and the importance of safety and security in cyberspace not only is important to us, but more to all technology companies. So this Paris call that President Macron called for, which built on the norms that Barbara referred to, that we should continue to enforce, had to support not only from the private sector, but more importantly, from government and private sector. So in 2018, when the Paris call was called for, I'm happy, as a Japanese, I'm happy to say that the Japanese government, as well as 50 other countries, were first to support the Paris call. And to David's point, in Japan as well, to not only did the Japanese government support the Paris call, but in 2018, Kazuo's company, Hitachi, Fujitsu, JCIC, and also Panasonic were one of the first Japanese companies to support the Paris call in 2018. On the 1-year anniversary of the Paris call, I'm happy to say that the Keidanren, which is the most prominent industry association in Japan, as well as DNA, they're, I guess, a game company, Yahoo Japan, Rakuten, Mercari, and also NEC, were also Japanese companies that lined up to support this Paris call. I'll end on the point that it sort of refers back to Barbara's point. But now I think there are 74 democracies, which once again including Japan and many of the European countries, 1,000 companies, which includes the Japanese companies that I've mentioned. But unfortunately, there are countries which have not supported the Paris call: China, Russia, India, and the United States. So I will end on that point. Thank you, David, for the question.
Okay. The United States always seems to be in that position, historically also. Josh, let me ask you, how do you see the Japan society role relative to the industrial collaboration between US and Japan?
Thank you, David. Let me just pick up on that point because, on the one hand, I'm kind of holding my head in shame given the way the US has handled the public health crisis out there. But I would have thought on cybersecurity, given that this is something that in some ways, as Greg has already mentioned with his long career and many people on this panel, we should be leading the space. And to see the United States not in this, it's one thing to see China and Russia not in this, or Iran. But unfortunately, I see a pattern developing here where the politicization and the polarization of our society has made it almost impossible to lead on the global stage right now. And I think particularly on cybersecurity, we're going to get into a place where kind of others are going to act first. They're going to lock things in, and then we're going to be actively trying to take apart this. The beauty of the post-World War II system that the Americans helped lead was that we didn't try to impose it on our own. We worked within the framework and we brought our allies. Here you have a cry from the Japanese that were the first movers, the Europeans, others, for American leadership. And instead of stepping in, we've almost, to use a soccer or a football analogy, scored an own goal. So I really hope that when it comes to cybersecurity and when it comes to even climate change as well, that's another Paris call that we chose to take ourselves out of, in that these two kind of both existential but also critical areas for America's economy and our road to recovery post-COVID, given that all of us are working from home, all of us are using these cyber norms that maybe when they were designed as open systems were okay, but now they need to be protected. We need to do a better job. And I think that's where I see Japan society's role. We're not the government. We don't have any special connection or ability to influence, although we have a great board and abilities to raise the conversation. I think as an American nonprofit that's been leading in the US-Japan space, we need to draw attention to exactly the type of conversation we're having right now, because too often the US-Japan conversation is very small and narrowly focused because it's been around for so long. It focuses almost exclusively on some very, very difficult issues, things like Okinawa basing issues or things like a free trade zone. These are critical issues. I'm not taking away from their importance, but I would argue that what we just heard from the panel is something that we should all be raising to our top leadership and say, what is our strategy? How are the US and Japan going to work on this? How are we going to protect our citizens, everything from our data to our privacy? What are we doing? And so I think in that role, that while Japan society has had a long and 113-year history and has done an amazing job when it comes to our arts and culture, this is an area we need to be moving more into when it comes to our business and technology, because that is a part of our future. It's something that we as societies, as people, as nations need to be addressing. And we have a role to play to kind of push people in the right direction and to spotlight these conversations.
Thank you. Let me, before I ask the next question, let me just make a comment. One of the most successful activities in establishing, let me call them technological norms in the past 30 years has been what's happened in the Internet protocol space, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is a non-governmental activity which has managed to get people from almost every nation in the world involved while carefully keeping government in its place. That may be an interesting direction. Government is very hard to move. It has to be addressed, it has to be moved, but there may be better ways to attack it. Just a thought. I'd like to next, I'm just going down the list. I think we're getting good output from each one of these questions. Barbara, from your role at MITRE, how do you see the significance of the norms in the context of the US-Japan and beyond?
Well, I think going back to my point earlier, I think that the US and Japan are developing norms, and whether you write the norms down or whether they're understood, I think that they can have the same kind of influence. But I think once you expand beyond US-Japan, you get into the issues that Ken talked about. Who is at the table and who is participating? And so the US and Japan cannot do this alone. We can start the conversation, we can come to agreement, but to have a real impact, we've got to realize that more have to be at the table. And I think one of the challenges Japan has is it lives in a very bad neighborhood. I mean, this is a very bad cyber neighborhood that it's in. And so I think the important thing is going back also to the point of, US showing some leadership and trying to bring others to the table to help its allies, such as Japan, in these difficulties is important. But I think one of the challenges we have about norms is we can agree to them, but they can essentially become shelfware. You know, that we've got this pretty report and some ideas, but it never comes to fruition. And I think that that's the real challenge moving forward, is how do we take these and make them mean something by changing behaviors in a positive way. And so we have a question from the audience about, do we leave the implementation of the norms just to good intentions? And I think the fact is that good intentions are not good enough, and that we have to come up with some kind of way, whether it is shame or whether sanctions, or whether it is, if you want to participate in this global supply chain that Kazuo has talked about, that you have to participate by playing the rules, as opposed to, you know, making it what we would call the wild, wild west, which is where, you know, anything goes. And so I think that the US and Japan, by working together, can be a good example of trying to make this something that others can join. But the problem, as Ken talked about, is the US has abdicated its leadership role in a number of places. And so I hope that it will, in the future, continue to work with Japan closely as it has in the past, but do it in a way that's trying to together provide leadership, as opposed to the US just telling everybody, do it our way or the highway.
Agreed. Kazuo, I'm going to switch the subject slightly to one of the questions here. What are the International Cybersecurity Center of Excellence members doing to foster the adoption of cyber norms?
Yes, thank you for the question. That's close to my heart. Yes, thank you. The intention of the INC-COE is one nation or one company cannot accomplish this important issue of global cybersecurity. And as Josh clearly mentioned. And so from academia perspective, it's very neutral compared with political or international relationship. So how to get the very practical as well as more long-lasting the thinking as well as implementation is going to be. So this is a place that INC-COE can facilitate the discussion throughout, for instance, this symposium as well as the webinar series and so on, and getting the real discussion having. And for instance, yesterday, there are a lot of interesting conversation came. For instance, the trust deficit among nations, how the cooperation can address that. The cooperation can be the part to solve the problems technically. For instance, digital trust chain or cross-referencing or using the list, or further critical or information area that's classified information from civilian perspective going forward with, say, a controlled unclassified information. What is good for the citizens' perspective rather than traditional military attacks. We don't want to go into that escalation. But so those discussions and the practical things adjusting to the current technology area, that particularly digital trust areas, Society 5.0 in Japan, and US-Japan perspective has US-Japan digital trade agreement happened last year, how we can implement what's the thought to facilitate and thinking about some solutions. Those things are happening in the working group and the projects, if we can form. And For instance, most difficult one, as Katayama-san said, is there's a no law, international law, or some audience also questioned, there's a no law to punish by international law at this point in this cybersecurity area, how to make things practical perspective. So those, if we can adapt gradually this digital world, that would be great. So that's a hope for the INC-COE's perspective.
Okay, the term with trust raised, in my mind, an interesting area that's turned out, courtesy of COVID, to be more than casual, and that's the ability to share medical information internationally with trust. Has really damaged the ability to actually attack the epidemic, because it's almost impossible to trade information, medical information, across international boundaries by law with any degree of trust. Looking at an area where one might actually manage to get some agreements, that may be it. Anyway, we have a few minutes to go, actually about 5 minutes to go. So what I'm going to do is just make a fast circle around the board and ask you to make any final comments. Craig, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I'll just keep it very short. I mean, this is an area.
Keep it short.
Yeah, Keio and Columbia will continue to work on together through the dialogue we've initiated. This activity, sort of a point in that dialogue. I encourage everybody who's interested in this topic to continue to communicate with Dave, myself, and others on the panel, like Josh, that are in Kazuo, who are part of that dialogue, and help us continue talking about this very important subject.
Let's see, going down the list, Ken.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. So I'd like to end on a positive note. I think we all want to go in that way. And I think on my haste, I may have forgotten to mention an important company, NEC, which is also a very important supporter of the Paris Call. So I guess what I'm saying is that on a positive note, Barbara mentioned that these discussions are, continually going, but I think it's important, especially in Japan, the private sector is getting more involved in these kind of discussions. So I hope that, will help Kazuo's work on the INC-COE as well too. So, I'd like to end on a positive note that the Japanese industry hopefully will be more interested and involved in these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, Josh.
Yeah, to pick up on the positive note, I'm a known optimist despite everything going on in our country. And I just think this is an opportunity in some ways. And even like the Paris Climate Accords, even though the United States government has pulled out, New York City, the state of California, there are ways in which, because this is not dominated by just a nation state, as Barbara so aptly put, and as we've seen throughout the conference, we've heard from different government positions and Kono-san and others, there are a lot of us that have a vested interest in the future success and being able to make the cyber domain not like the Wild West, but to make it a civilized kind of engine for growth, given that increasingly in all of our countries, particularly Japan and the US, the engine for growth is going to be in this innovation sector. We owe it to ourselves and to our societies to do that. And so I'm looking forward to working, and I'm glad that Keio and Columbia have brought these together. I'm excited that companies like Microsoft and Keio, and obviously the work that Barbara and her team are doing as well. There's a lot more on the public-private sector we didn't get a chance to deal with that I think should be brought more and more to light, not just for the DC and Tokyo crowd, but bringing it larger to the business crowds in Silicon Valley, New York, Osaka, other parts of Japan and the US. We need to bring everyone in. So this is a full court press and a call to action. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation. And I am an optimist and believe that US and Japan can make a difference if we work together towards the future.
Barbara?
So I think one of the really important points that came out of all this conversation from these panelists is that everybody has a role in this. Academia, the private sector, government, importantly, that's not just the federal governments, but state governments, that there's all these different players have a role to play to make this work. And the more that you bring them together, the bigger impact you can have. And so, although I was sort of the negative person earlier in talking about who's not at the table, I think on the positive side, you can look at who is at the table. And the more that you've got different organizations and you get sort of this critical mass together, you can almost sort of crowd out the others who don't want to come to the table, and you can make it so that it is to their benefit to come to the table. I mean, that's what you have to do, is make it so there is a reason for them to say, okay, I'm going to participate in a positive way. So that's what I would like to see in the future, is figuring out a way to get everybody going in the same direction.
Kazuo, you have the few seconds remaining.
Yes, thank you so much for this panel. So because of the COVID, we are locked in our house. This is a way that we can think about something new normal for innovation. And the US-Japan is a critical relationship in the historical term from my perspective. And hope that we can work together for the good purpose for the next generations. Yeah, thank you so much again to get this panel, Farber Sensei.
This has been an enjoyable thing. I think we actually have 30 seconds to go, but please, we, Keio and Columbia, expect to continue the exercise with a lot of vigor now that the academic term in the summer's gone. So we welcome people to participate. They can contact either me or Greg to weld themselves in, or almost anybody here can contact us. So I thank you all. This is one of the nicest panels I've chaired. So again, thank you. And I guess we can give them back we're exactly on time. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your moderation.
Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you all.